You've been told the Tullianum was Rome's state prison, a dark hole beneath the forum where enemies awaited execution, but the archaeological evidence reveals something far more disturbing. This wasn't a prison at all, because prisoners imply trials, records, and eventual release, and what happened in that underground chamber left no survivors, no documentation, and no bodies that were ever meant to be found. Right now, beneath the church of San Giuseppe dei Felgnami in Rome, there's a stone chamber that predates the Roman Republic itself, and for over 1,000 years it served a single purpose: making people disappear so completely that even their deaths went unrecorded. And if you examine the historical record carefully, tracking who entered that chamber and what happened afterward, you'll find something more chilling than execution. You'll find systematic erasure, the deliberate obliteration of human beings from history itself, carried out with legal sanction and cultural approval in the heart of the world's most sophisticated civilization. Here's what we know for certain. The Tullianum sits at the base of the Capitoline Hill, carved directly into living rock sometime around the 7th century BCE. The structure consists of two chambers: an upper room with a single entrance, and beneath it, a lower chamber accessible only through a circular opening in the floor. No stairs, no ladder, just a hole 12 feet deep into darkness. Ancient sources call the lower chamber the Tullianum proper, Tullius in Latin, possibly derived from Tullius meaning spring, because groundwater seeps through the stone walls, or possibly from an Etruscan word we can no longer translate but which appears in context suggesting ritual pollution. The linguistic uncertainty itself tells you something. This place was so feared that even its name carried contamination. Listen carefully to what Sallust writes about this chamber in the 1st century BCE. He describes it as a place of execution about 12 feet deep, enclosed on all sides by walls and above by a vault of stone. Its appearance is disgusting and terrible by reason of neglect, darkness, and stench. Read that again. Neglect, as if the horror was somehow accidental, some unfortunate byproduct of administrative oversight. But Sallust was writing propaganda, softening the truth for an audience that already knew what the Tullianum was and preferred not to examine it too closely. Because here's what he doesn't say: who cleaned it, who maintained it, who decided when it would be used, and what happened to the bodies afterward. The historical record gives us names. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, ally turned enemy of Rome, starved to death in the Tullianum in 104 BCE after being paraded through the streets in Marius's triumph. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who united the tribes against Julius Caesar, strangled in the Tullianum in 46 BCE after 6 years of captivity, displayed first in Caesar's triumph so Rome could see him broken, then disposed of in the dark. Sejanus's children, a daughter barely adolescent and a son not yet 10, executed in the Tullianum in 31 CE because Roman law forbade executing virgins. So the girl was raped by the executioner first, then strangled. A detail Tacitus records with clinical precision because he wants you to understand exactly what Roman law permitted when convenience demanded it. But those are the famous names, the ones important enough that historians bothered recording their deaths. What about the others? What about the Capitoline conspirators that Cicero boasts about eliminating without trial? What about the Christians that Nero's government made disappear during the persecution of 64 CE? What about the slaves who participated in Spartacus's rebellion, the ones who weren't crucified along the Appian Way but were instead taken to Rome for processing? The Tullianum had capacity for maybe a dozen people at once in the lower chamber, but Rome conducted mass arrests. Where did those people go? Here's where the evidence becomes deliberately obscured. Roman execution was public spectacle. Crucifixions lined major roads. Arena deaths entertained crowds. Public beheadings in the Forum demonstrated the state's power. But the Tullianum was underground, hidden, accessible only through the Mamertine Prison above it, and entrance to that prison was restricted to officials with specific authorization. No crowds, no witnesses. Just stone walls, darkness, and the executioner. When someone entered the Tullianum, Rome wanted them gone not just from life but from memory, and the architecture itself was designed to facilitate that erasure. Consider the mechanics. The lower chamber has no drainage beyond the natural spring that seeps through the rock. Bodies decompose, fluids accumulate. The smell that Sallust describes as disgusting wasn't neglect, it was inevitable consequence. Yet the Tullianum remained in continuous use for over 7 centuries. Someone was cleaning it, someone was removing bodies, someone was maintaining the space as functional. But there are no job descriptions for Tullianum attendants in any administrative record. No payment vouchers, no work rosters. The people who operated Rome's erasure machine were themselves erased from documentation. This is the part historians rarely mention. Execution in Rome required legal authority. A magistrate had to issue the order, a quaestor had to authorize it, official records had to be maintained. But when researchers examine the documentary evidence for Tullianum deaths, they find something disturbing. Most entries are ambiguous. Prisoners are listed as delivered to punishment or removed from custody without specifying death. The language is deliberately vague, creating plausible deniability. And for many periods, especially during political transitions, there are no records at all. Blank spaces in the archives where names should be. Now understand what this means practically. When Jugurtha died, Sallust tells us he was thrown into the Tullianum, and that some say he died in 6 days from starvation, others that poison was administered to him. Notice the uncertainty. This was a king, a figure important enough that multiple historians recorded his death, and we still don't know exactly how he died or when. The ambiguity was intentional. It prevented martyr narratives. It denied families the certainty needed for vengeance or commemoration. The Tullianum didn't just kill people, it killed their stories. Here's the evidence that makes this undeniable. Archaeological excavation of the Tullianum in the 19th century found almost no human remains. A chamber used for executions across 7 centuries, and the archaeological record is nearly empty. Where are the bones? Where are the burial goods, the personal effects, the material traces of hundreds or thousands of deaths? They were removed, systematically, probably dumped in the Tiber or scattered in unmarked pits outside the city. Because leaving evidence meant creating shrines, it meant giving victims permanence. And Rome understood that permanent victims become martyrs and martyrs inspire resistance. Read Tacitus's account of Sejanus's children again. He specifies that the bodies were dragged to the Tiber with hooks, a detail he includes because it was unusual enough to note. The standard procedure wasn't river disposal, it was something else. Something so routine that historians didn't bother recording it because everyone already knew. That gap in the record, that assumption of shared knowledge about disposal procedures, tells you that Tullianum deaths were common enough to have standardized protocols that no one felt necessary to document. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Early Christian tradition claims that Saints Peter and Paul were imprisoned in the Tullianum before their executions under Nero. The Church of San Giuseppe dei Felgnami was built directly above the chamber specifically to commemorate this. Pilgrims visit, they pray, they venerate the space as holy ground. And there's something profoundly dark about transforming an execution chamber into a religious shrine, about sanctifying the very architecture of state murder, about placing an altar above the hole where people were thrown to die in darkness. It's historical revision at its most aggressive, taking a space designed for erasure and forcing it to mean the opposite, to guarantee eternal memory for specific victims while all the others remain deliberately forgotten. Consider who gets remembered and who doesn't. Jugurtha was a king, Vercingetorix led armies, Sejanus was Praetorian prefect, Peter and Paul became saints. Their names survived because they were important enough that erasure failed. But what about the grain thief executed for stealing during a famine? What about the slave who spoke against his master? What about the foreign merchant accused of espionage? What about the prostitute who knew too much about a senator's activities? The Tullianum processed them all identically. Darkness, strangulation or starvation, body disposal, archival silence. The difference is that some victims were too important to completely erase, so their deaths got recorded as warnings. The rest simply vanished. The machinery of this system required specific conditions. First, legal ambiguity, laws that permitted summary execution for categories of people deemed unworthy of trial. Second, architectural isolation, a space that physically prevented witnesses and guaranteed official control of narrative. Third, bureaucratic deniability, documentation practices that obscured rather than recorded. Fourth, cultural acceptance, a society that agreed certain people deserved not just death but erasure. Rome achieved all 4. The Tullianum wasn't an aberration. It was the logical expression of a civilization that divided humanity into those who mattered and those who could be disposed of without consequence. And it worked. The system functioned for over 700 years, from the Roman kingdom through the Republic and well into the Empire. It survived regime changes, civil wars, and cultural transformations. Why? Because every government, regardless of ideology, found use for a place where problems could disappear without trial, without documentation, without public accountability. The specific victims changed, kings gave way to conspirators, then Christians, then political rivals, but the function remained constant. Throw them in the hole, wait for silence, remove the evidence. Here's what the archaeological evidence reveals when you examine it carefully. The lower chamber shows signs of repeated modification. The floor was lowered at least twice, the walls reinforced, the drainage improved slightly. These weren't emergency repairs, they were upgrades. Someone was investing resources in maintaining the Tullianum's functionality across generations. That requires institutional commitment. It requires budget allocation. It requires training new executioners and disposal teams. It requires an entire administrative apparatus dedicated to making people disappear. And that apparatus left almost no trace because everyone involved understood that documentation was liability. The Christian tradition about Peter and Paul is probably fabricated. There's no contemporary evidence placing them in the Tullianum specifically, and the story only appears in sources written centuries after their deaths. But the fabrication itself is revealing. Early Christians needed their martyrs to have suffered in Rome's worst place, to have endured maximum horror before achieving salvation. The Tullianum's reputation was so terrible that associating martyrs with it amplified their sanctity. The same space that Rome used for erasure became, in Christian memory, proof of faith's triumph over oppression. It's historical irony at its cruelest. The victims Rome tried hardest to forget became the only ones definitively remembered. But that redemptive narrative obscures something important. For every Peter or Paul who gets commemorated, there were dozens of unnamed others who died identically and were forgotten completely. The Christian martyrs weren't special because the Tullianum was worse for them. They're special because their community cared enough to preserve their stories despite Roman efforts at erasure. The real horror isn't what happened to famous victims. It's what happened to everyone else. The systematic, bureaucratized, legally sanctioned disappearance of human beings whose names we'll never know because the machinery designed to erase them functioned exactly as intended. The Tullianum remained in use until at least the 4th century CE, when Christian emperors began restricting its function. But it wasn't demolished. It was converted into a church, literally sanctifying the space where the empire had committed institutional murder for a millennium. And if you visit today, you'll descend through that hole in the floor, you'll stand in the chamber where people died screaming, and you'll see religious icons and crosses and pilgrims praying. The darkness has been replaced with electric lights. The stench is gone, the spring water is clean. All evidence of function has been carefully removed, replaced with spiritual meaning that denies the chamber's actual history. The definitive truth is this. The Tullianum wasn't Rome's darkest dungeon because of what happened there. Execution happened everywhere in Rome, arenas, forums, roadsides. The Tullianum was darkest because it was designed specifically for erasure, for making people disappear so completely that their deaths wouldn't even count as deaths, just administrative removals from the population register. The architecture, the bureaucracy, the cultural silence, all of it worked together to create a machine for historical obliteration. And it succeeded. We have names for maybe a few dozen victims across 7 centuries of operation. The rest are gone, not just dead gone. No graves, no memorials, no documentary trace. Just stone walls that saw everything and recorded nothing. If you've learned anything from this investigation into Rome's machinery of disappearance, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting, because we're going to keep excavating the historical evidence that civilizations prefer to leave buried in darkness. The Tullianum proves that the most sophisticated societies are often the most efficient at making inconvenient people vanish, and the systems they create for erasure outlast the victims by millennia. The hole beneath the Capitoline Hill is still there. The spring still seeps through the stone, and if you listen carefully in the silence, you might hear what Rome spent 1,000 years trying to eliminate. The testimony of the forgotten demanding to be counted. What other historical silences should we break? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.